And he would literally put his jacket over the back of his chair, go to the vending machine, buy a can of like Dr. Pepper, pop the top on it, sit it by his computer, which he had programmed to run a series of colorful loops, gone off to South Street Seaport, had a bunch of beers with his buddies, come back at like 8 o'clock at night. Because he wanted it to look when the boss happened to walk by on his way home that, oh, he must just be out at the men's room or something, right?
What would happen if we just told the truth?
Welcome to Truth Works, where we dig into the nitty-gritty of leadership and work.
And what needs to change. I'm Jessica Neal.
And I'm Patty McCord.
Our journey together started in HR, but trust us, it's evolved into something wild, honest, and well, a bit rebellious.
So throw out the handbook. We're here to redefine rules to work for us, not against us.
Let's dive into another episode.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to Truth Works. I'm Patty McCord.
I'm Jessica Neal.
And today we have as a guest Rita McGrath. And Rita and I have known each other for a couple of years now. I like to say that she's a fellow author. So we get together when we do all those famous author things. Rita's a professor at Columbia and has been there for a really long time at Columbia Business School. She's had lots of accolades over the year. Number one in strategy from the Thinkers 50. She's one of the 10 top management thinkers in the world. The other thing about Rita that I think is really important for our listeners on this podcast is Rita's big picture. She's all about strategy. And so I want to know a little more about your journey from, how'd you get into management thinking? How'd you get into the big strategy thinking? Just talk to us about you, Rita McGrath.
Wow. For human beings, that is such a welcome invitation. Everybody likes to talk about themselves.
I know.
Well, so I started off with my bachelor's degree thinking I was going to go into public service. So I got a degree in political science, then I did a master's in public administration, and I was a card-carrying bureaucrat for a fair number of years. And what we were doing, and you'll relate to this, Patty, back in those days, we were doing what was called computerization.
Oh, yeah, before AI.
Well, don't forget we had digital transformation in between. So
that's right.
This was like the very early stages. Then in that process, I got really interested in what it takes to change a big, risk-averse organization to a whole new way of operating. And I just found that fascinating. So I guess that's sort of big picture. Then I decided to go back and get my PhD, which I did at the Wharton School. And there I ran into Ian McMillan, who was running a center there dedicated to entrepreneurship. And he wanted to know what I was prepared to study as a PhD student. I said, I'd really love to study the science of implementation. And he looked at me and he said, I can't think of anything more boring than studying science of implementation.
Yeah, it isn't that catchy, I have to admit.
Yeah. Well, anyway, good fortune shone on me in the form of the Citibank organization. And there was a champion there who was really interested in funding a research study of their adventures and misadventures in corporate venturing. And so it was a 3-year grant, and I was the one that was the main principal researcher on it. And that got me into the world of venturing. And when you think about it, corporate venturing is just one of many kinds of corporate changes that you can have. So it kind of fit my interest and Mac's interest. And that led to my dissertation, which was about how established companies learn to do new things. So I was going to do a postdoc at Wharton. We'd raised all the money. My dissertation was finished. And then I get this call from Ming-Jer Chen, who at the time was at Columbia. And he said, hey, this year we have an opening in our strategy group. It's a small group. I can't guarantee there'll be an opening when you're ready to come on the market. Why don't you come on down and give us a job talk? And I thought, well, why not? It's good practice, if nothing else, and they'll buy me a nice dinner. I mean, what's wrong with that? So went down, gave my talk, and my dissertation was done already, so I was in really good shape. And I get a call a couple of weeks later saying that I was actually their number 2 candidate. And you may know him. Their number 1 candidate was a guy named Ranjay Gulati, who's now at Harvard. And he swept the sort of job stakes that year. Like every school wanted him. And then he finally had to make a choice, and it didn't turn out to be Columbia. So I get the call saying, guess what? You've got the job. So people always ask me, like, tell me about your job search. As though they're going to learn something replicable in this.
Yeah, it's great to be number two sometimes.
It was actually. It was. And what
Yeah.
was beautiful about it was I wasn't even offended. It was like I wasn't planning to apply to begin with. So I thought number two was pretty good first time out of the gate. So that got me to Columbia and a series of research studies based on my dissertation and other work I'd done in the course of the Citibank study. And I just got fascinated at this increasing convergence between strategy and innovation. And just to set the scene for your listeners, when I first started, which was a while ago, all the cool kids were doing, strategy at the industry level, right? So it was all 5 forces and order of entry and how much R&D intensity did you have? And those of us studying innovation, like what goes on inside companies, we were sort of huddled together in a corner for warmth. And over the years, those two fields have really come together. I think as technology and the pace of change have increased, companies are kind of going, oh, hang on, innovation isn't just something I do like every 15 years and then I just exploit what I've got for the rest of my life. I actually have to engage in innovation on a more regular basis.
And what do you think? I mean, what's dramatically different than, what you wrote in that first dissertation and what you're finding now? I mean, I do get that everybody says, oh, it's really important because Jessica and I certainly see that. Both of us work with big and small companies. So, like, now it should be how you breathe, is it?
No, in most companies, it's not.
No, I was going to say it can't be. Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
Well, so this is my new book project. I'm working on a new one, which looks at what I'm calling permissionless organizations. So I'll be drawing on a lot of your work, Patty. And I think this truth at work is really important. But before I go there, so when you look at the lifespan of a typical large corporation, and these are the household names, right? This is Sears Roebuck, Motorola, you name it, right? If you look at their actual lifespans, they typically top out at about 50 years. And maybe you get 60, maybe you get 40, but around that time. So the typical company just can't seem to figure out how not to get into deep, dark trouble. And so what I've identified is a couple of different reasons for that. And the first reason is if your leadership really doesn't want you to live for a long time, like all they want to do is strip out the money and leave you as a carcass. Well, that's going to be a problem for longevity. But the other ones are more subtle. And one of them is that as a company grows, the number of people who are just dedicated to keeping the company, functioning increases relative to the people that are actually serving customers or facing externally. Secondly, is incentives are often quite inadvertently set up to reward politics and to reward keeping the existing business going. So that's a big problem. Third is that you have what I call the collective action problem. So as a company gets more complex, you got things that would be really good from a company point of view, but maybe not attractive from an individual business or an individual leader's point of view. And so you start to have all these suboptimal decisions creeping in, and none of this gets called out while a company's making lots of money. So we all know a few companies, many of them located not too far from where you guys are, that, through past brilliance and dumb luck have just been sitting on piles and piles and piles of money. So all this stuff just goes on. And then the last thing is succession. It turns out that we are terrible at succession planning and executing against succession ideas. And one of the most interesting findings that has come out of that for me is that if you look at really successful companies, there's often a visionary type person, right, at some point in the company's role. And then they're often partnered up with an operations type person, right?
Yep.
Well, let's say the visionary moves on. Then the board, the management team, the structure, they instantly kind of, without really thinking about it, turn to the operations person and say, okay, heir apparent, you're next. Well, think about that for a minute, right? If you've got now the operations person's in charge, what are they going to care about? They're going to care about the existing business, operate exactly. New things are weird, And now here's the other next wrinkle, which is an operator is very happy to work with a visionary, no problem there. A visionary reporting to an operator, not so much.
Yeah, no, not so much. That's fascinating. I want to talk a little bit about it's just happening. It's the way organizations grow, especially if you're successful, right? But this creep, all these things are creeping in. So have you studied or researched a company that was good at recognizing that and addressing it? Or is it just inevitable that, the bigger and the more success you have, it just is going to happen?
So this is actually a body of work that was studied years and years ago by a guy named Arie de Geus he was with Royal Dutch Shell, and he wrote a fabulous book called The Living Company. And what his conclusion was that, if we were human beings and we only lived to be 30 years old, but our potential lifespan was 100 years, we would be shocked at how much we were underperforming in terms of our total potential. And his argument is that the classic corporation does that. So he went back and he looked at companies that were as old as 600 years, 500 years, and there's not that many of them, but there are some. And what he found was that they tend to really embrace learning. They have a mindset that says, I have to leave this place better when I'm done with it than I was when I walked in. Very little in the way of politics, as we would conventionally think of it, self-serving, self-dealing politics. People who really want to be with the company for their careers, by and large. So they want to make sure it's a good place, right? And lastly, an interesting mix of adventurousness with respect to experimentation, but conservatism with respect to risk. And this real sense of long time horizons. So what I would say, if I bring that to the clutch of companies I tend to work with, is this theme of what I'm calling permissionlessness, which allows companies to, first of all, more and more of the companies actually exposed to the environment. So you're feeling directly what's going on. And I think at Netflix, that was one of the examples of a company that was able to set that up, I think, fairly effectively. So you get feedback from your environment continuously. Whereas in another organizational design, that those feedback loops get cut off. So the company becomes internally referential, and it doesn't realize when it's got to make an adjustment to cope to its environment.
Right. And I think you said a couple of things that are really important. I mean, one of them that you just said was, it's fascinating to me that you cannot feel your customer feedback, whatever you're doing, with the world as open as it is, right? I mean, we look, we're touching each other, we're having a real conversation through a computer, and why don't companies do that? The second one that I think is super important that we talk about a lot is, man, you keep these incentives forever that are the same, that actually incentivize you to not be innovative, to not do something new and different. And, that just becomes part of the fabric, and nobody ever thinks about looking at those things.
And especially with the rewarding of political behavior, right? So can you walk us through that, Rita? Why does this all happen?
Well, so I think what's interesting to me is that a lot of bosses reward what I'll call the negative politics. And I think there are positive politics too, but I'll focus on the negative politics, which means I'm behaving in such a way that I'm going to get an outcome that's good for me, that has nothing to do with my contribution to value or the customer or the company, right? So that's political behavior in the negative sense. So let's say I come to my boss and I say, I'm doing really well, I need a raise, or I've got a counteroffer from XYZ company and I'm really valuable to your company and I think you should give me a raise. Well, and the boss might very, with good intentions say, I want to hear you out. I want to hear what your concerns are. I want to be open about this. But here's the mistake. Let's say they say, okay, you've made a really good case. I'll reward that. Well, within 2 nanoseconds, every other person who's at that same person's band now knows the way you get a raise, the way you get ahead, the way you get something you want is you go pester the boss. And then what starts to happen is there's a whole behavior set that's created about make sure the boss thinks you're looking good, make sure the boss thinks you're looking busy. We had a student at Columbia who had an internship at one of these heavy duty investment banks downtown. And he would literally put his jacket over the back of his chair, go to the vending machine, buy a can of Dr. Pepper, pop the top on it, sit it by his computer, which he had programmed to run a series of colorful loops, gone off to South Street Seaport, had a bunch of beers with his buddies, come back at 8 o'clock at night. Because he wanted it to look, when the boss happened to walk by on his way home, that, he must just be out at the men's room or something, right?
I used to park myself in front of the executive conference room because it was a company that worked with Singapore. And so all the executives would gather together at 7 o'clock at night and have this meeting with everybody in Singapore, right? And I would sit outside of the big walnut double doors on a little bench I did the same thing. I'd go home, have dinner, come back. They'd be like, oh, Patty, Wow, I've been meaning to talk to you about something. Well, I'm here.
Look at you, smart lady.
Yeah.
But look, I mean, Patty and I are very familiar with that scenario because
Yeah.
we have to combat it, or had to combat it, organizationally in our roles, where you're right. People see this is the way to do it, and then they just start doing it, and everybody's doing it. And then it's wrong. And I don't, would you call that political in nature, that behavior?
Well, I think people respond to incentives, right?
Yeah.
And you've got to design a system where the incentives don't inadvertently, and by the way, none of this is bad intention, right? I mean, and I rather say that. I mean, people don't get up in the morning and say, there are some, but most people don't get up in the morning and say, I'm going to be as evil as I possibly can be today. I mean, that's not
That's right.
normal.
Yeah.
There are psychopaths, we all know them. But anyway.
Yeah. Or Bernie Madoff.
Yeah. So what I think happens is that people are trying to be effective in a situation they have neither prepared them for nor thought completely through. And especially if they're inexperienced, especially if they don't see two or three, plays behind what's going to happen if they behave in a certain way, I think it's very easy to quite unintentionally stumble into this. So there's a great article by Safi Bahcall, who I know you know, Patty, and it's called The Innovation Equation. And what Safi talks about is, he said, how do you design systems so that you minimize return on politics? And there are ways to do it, but they're different than the way many organizations operate. So let me lay out a couple. So one is separate out the line of command from the line of promotions and pay. And how that works is you might report to somebody, right, who's your official superior. But if you're going to get promoted or you're going to get a pay increase, you're actually voted on by a third party, either individual or committee, that assesses what you're doing on the basis of your contribution, right? That's how academics do it. We have what's called a promotion and tenure committee, and they are not your department chair. And what they look at is how many papers did you publish and where did you go speak and, blah, blah, blah. So separating out those two roles, I think, is one thing. Another thing you can do is you can award peak assignments through some kind of third party algorithm. So if there's like in a big consulting company, say, if there's a number of assignments that are considered to be especially desirable, you put together your pool of people who are qualified and have the algorithm offer them those opportunities. Because if you don't do that, what happens is there's these normal laws of human interaction, right? Which is we tend to like people who are like us. We tend to trust people who are like us, and we tend to trust people that we know. And if you put those three things together, that shapes how jobs get handed out, how promotions get handed out, and. And one of the most fascinating manifestations of this that I've seen is I have a colleague at Columbia who tags people with sensors, and so he can track their movement through a room. And so these are people who deliberately go to a networking event. Now let this sink in. This is an event at which your entire purpose for going is to meet new people. They come into the event, and the first thing they do is clump together in groups of people who all know each other.
It's so true.
It's so fascinating. So, in your book, Seeing Around Corners, I love it. I love the concept of trying to get people to say, the better you can be at seeing around, and at Netflix, we ended up luckily being pretty good at guessing what was around the corner. But is it the unexpected? Is it the shock? Is it you just talked about using algorithms, right? Is it the shock that shocks a company into change? Or will it just naturally just keep going like it's going as long as the money comes in?
Well, it's really hard to get a company to change when all is well. So you've either got to manufacture a crisis, or you've got to figure out a way of, as Andy Grove used to say, creating constructive paranoia in your organization. And Grove was pretty good at doing that. He was one of the original people to talk about inflection points. What I do think is super useful, especially if a company is doing well, if you have your helpful Cassandras, if you have your people who are able to get out to what I call the edges of the organization and say, whoa, there's a competitor's box in the warehouse that we never saw there before. Or, hey, have you figured out this new technology that can make whatever we're doing obsolete? Maybe not tomorrow, but in 2 years. And so you need to have a real flow of that kind of early warning information back to the people that are actually making decisions. And what another fascinating thing to me is the people who see it are often not in the strategic decision-making role, right? So I'll use the example of my dad. This is one of my favorite favorite examples. So my dad was an academic. Then he went to Xerox. So he'd actually been at the Palo Alto Research Center. So he came back with stories about computer mice and graphical user interfaces. We all thought he was nuts. But anyway, he literally visited the future, right? He'd been there. And then he was hired at Kodak. And so this guy named Thomas Whiteley, who when he retired went into the business of studying dinosaurs. I mean, I just can't think of a more apt metaphor, right?
Yeah, right.
Anyway, so Whiteley says to my dad, well, so, Wolfgang, tell me what you see as the future. Now, this was in 1980. And, the future was like the future we know now was just beginning to emerge. And so my dad looks at him across the desk and, lays it all out. He's 8 billion films had it. Everything's going to go digital. Chemical world is going to change completely. Just spills it all out. Look, the next 15 years completely accurately, maybe with a little bit off on timing, but the big trends, he saw all of them. So Whiteley's he's head of the Emulsion Research Laboratory at Kodak. So, you stick him in the army, bleeds silver halide, that kind of guy. Yeah, and he's like, thank you very much, Wolfgang. Please go back to R&D where you can do minimal harm, was kind of the position. And so I remember a few years after that, when I'd gotten my professor job and everything, and I recalled this conversation, and I went back to my dad and I said, well, didn't it bother you? And my dad looked at me and he said, what do you mean? I said, well, it was so clear to you in 1980 what was going to happen. And here we are, several decades later, and Kodak's a shadow of its former self. And, what do we do about that? And he looked at me and he said, well, why should it bother me? I said, well, it's a catastrophe, right? He said, look, I'm a scientist. I said, yes, I'm aware of that. And he's management, right? He asked me my opinion. I gave him my opinion. He's management. What he does with it is up to him. So I think one of the things we often just underutilize in these companies is that wealth of knowledge that's somewhere other than where management is, right?
Right. And when you tell this story about so when I was reading your bio, I'm like, it's in her blood. Right? The research, the scientists, when I talk to you, I'm like, oh, Rita's such a geek and I love her for it, right? That ability, it's not just the ability to see it, it's the courage that it takes to risk the business that you have. I mean, so my Netflix story was back in the Blockbuster days. And, I remember being on a conference call and we were listening to the Blockbuster earnings call. And someone asked John Antioco, CEO of Blockbuster at the time, what do you think about Netflix? And he said, they are an ant. They are a gnat. They are no one. No one will ever do this. Don't ever ask me about this again. And the whiteboard was behind the person I was looking at. And it was just our customer base. And we thought, oh, they don't know. But the terror when we realized, oh, shit, that means we have to give up the gas in the engine.
Yeah.
Right. The bulk of our employees, all these happy people who got us where we are today, right? The people who had the longest tenure, right? The system says reward the people that help get you where you are today, promote them, make them important. And they weren't important anymore.
So let me just add one thing to that, which is if you look, I'll take Facebook and Instagram as examples. So our human brains are wired to think in a linear way, right? So if I have a journey that's going to take me 100 days and I'm 30 days in, I think I should be like a third of the way there. Well, with Netflix and with Instagram, you were looking at companies that started out insignificant, continued to be insignificant, and then, whoa, where did that come from, right? So it's exponential. And most leaders don't see exponential change.
Yeah, I think one thing that we had at Netflix, which was different, is that we did build a system of feedback. I mean, we did. We relied on that, and Reed wanted that, and listened to it, and didn't take it all, but listened to it. And then when he did take it, he changed immediately if he thought you were right. And then we always, that paranoia that you were talking about, we were always sort of like, okay, that was good, but we can be better, right? Like, how do we get better? We were never very good at celebrating a lot. It was sort of like, yeah, okay, good, keep going, right? How do you do it better? How do you do it better? How do you do it better?
Yeah. I remember planning the $1 million person, the million customer party. And I said to Reed, I'm like, okay, what do you want to do? How do you want to do this? He's like, millions in the bag. 5. There's a number.
Yeah.
Like, it took us 5 years to get here.
Yeah, he wasn't into celebrating. And then he also, I think this served us well too. Like, we were not nostalgic. Like, we didn't talk about the past. It was really like about the future. And if you as a leader like got up and said, "Hey, remember like 2 years ago when we were like this and we had this many people," he would be so mad at you. And because it was all about the future. And then for us, and I'm Patty, you remember this, but it was when we did Quickster, Rich, we and Reed was, we had kind of grown up DVD by mail, and now we were heading into streaming, and streaming was the future. But he was so afraid that DVD would hold us back from that second S curve of business, and almost, I don't know, obsessive about it, Patty, and wanted to sever that business. Didn't want any of us that were working on the streaming to think about DVD at all. Reed was sort of that CEO that was a visionary. He was good at operating, but he also, I think, focused on the right things. And what I'm hearing from you too, just like in the Kodak example, the leader at the top sort of really matters to set the tone for a lot of these things.
Mm-hmm. So let's move to the future a little bit with you. What are people getting right now? What is still just huge blind spots? And then we don't have to talk about it in this response, but later, like you already talked about algorithms. Rita and I are part of a group where we back and forth argue, talk about all kinds of things with each other, with other people who are authors of management and business books. And Rita just jumped in the other day to talk about, how we reform teaching and how AI comes into like papers and stuff. So let's take 2 questions. One of them is anybody getting it right? Are people starting to see these sorts of things more quickly than they used to? Big companies? What's research is interesting to you right now?
Well, couple of things. So some companies get it more right than others. And I think there's kind of, call them almost maturity levels, right? So low maturity level is I just don't think about it. Then I've got the kind of dim awareness. Maybe I should think about it. Then you've got the companies that will do the big workshop and they'll bring in the futurist and all this stuff. And they're like, well, that was really fun. I love that book. And it goes on the shelf. And, so
right.
And then you got the companies that are actually prepared to take it on seriously. And that requires, the things that are hard. It requires follow through. It requires making the time. It requires being open to hearing the news, whether that's good or bad. And, you have to be willing to actually follow through if you're going to do this effectively as a company, as an organization. So one of the things I'm finding is companies use me as a forcing function. So it's like, we've got Rita on deck. We're paying her. She's showing up on February 28th. You better have something to tell her by the time she gets here. And, I was kind of worried about it at first because I'm like, I'm not adding magical, but maybe I am adding magical value, but like a lot of this they could do themselves, but they won't. It's just not in their job description. So I think that's kind of an interesting way to use an outside forcing function. With respect to what I think people are missing, there's a couple of big ones that I am just shocked nobody's talking about more. One is the whole advertising-based programmatic ad universe that we sleepwalked our way into. I think it's a bubble. And what's a classic bubble? A classic bubble is when something has a value in the marketplace that is completely uncorrelated with its actual economic value. And there's been some shocking work done on just how bad programmatic ad placement is. And here's just a couple of examples. There was a researcher who really wanted to track end to end. Somebody pushed the button, buy an ad, and how readily could they track it through to where the ad actually showed up on the internet. And it was 11% of the cases. The rest of it, the spend disappeared. Nobody knew where the ad went. Nobody knew whatever. Second example, eBay got into a spat with MSNBC and said, "Pox on your houses. I'm not paying anymore for advertising against the phrase eBay." So this researcher at Stanford thought, "Oh my God, naturally occurring experiment. Could I get access to your data before and after you stopped the ad spend?" And what he found, 0 difference in traffic before and after the ad spend, because it was eBay. if you type eBay into your search engine, you know where you want to go. Advertising is not going to change your behavior. And that's the third big kind of aha to me about advertising, which is how do you separate out the intent effect from the advertising effect? So if I was thinking about buying I'll make this up, Chipotle sandwich, right? And I've already made up my mind to buy a Chipotle sandwich, and I go on my online ordering function and it flashes me up ads for Chipotle. I was going there anyway. That money is wasted. So the total lack of evidence that these programmatic ads actually succeed in changing buying behavior, eventually somebody's going to figure that out. And that underpins like what pays for so much of our internet and economy and all these other things. And I don't think we've thought through what the second order consequences of that are going to be. So that's one big one that I'm sort of going, Mark. The other one, and you two will relate to this, is, we're looking at a real baby bust here. If you go to economies like Korea, right? So the per woman lifetime births required to maintain the population stable is about 2.1. In Korea, they're down to 0.7. And the women are just, as my friend Aviva Wittenberg-Cox says, they're voting with their wombs.
Oh, God, I hope so. My womb is ready to vote. I just want to put that out there.
But if there's a baby bust, then there's not enough people for innovation, for creation, for...
Well, I'll jump in. And I mean, a lot of times when I'm coaching a startup like you, I'm like, there's this cohort of people that you should consider hiring, and that's boomers. Mm-hmm. Right. And they don't want to work full time, and they don't want to, but they know a lot of stuff. Right. I mean, there is such a thing as wisdom. There is such a thing as there's 1,000 things that you and I both, Jess, right? It's like because of what we do. It's like been there, done that. And it's just not going to fly. Right. I mean, and is this worth you making the mistake to learn the lesson? Right. Back to learning organizations. Learning organizations have to make mistakes because then you learn from your mistakes. But some of them are just stupid. Right. And so, like, how do and we're living longer and we're healthier and we're working longer. Yeah. So where does that, I'm really, really happy that we've moved beyond the evil millennial movement. and now we're kind of running out of letters. Because the new generation is going to be so infinitesimally small, we'll call them, the 0.7ers or something.
The 0.7s.
So these are huge factors that are going to affect the workplace. And we're not talking about, I always love when people call me and say, I want to talk about the future of work. I'm like, what about it's now?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Like, what future? Like,
it's happening.
Yeah, it's happening.
So there's a really interesting data point that Keith Ferrazzi talks about. Do you know Keith? He's a really big expert on networking and everything. And what his company has developed is a scale that measures team bondedness at work. And the kinds of questions they ask are things like, has your team got your back, right? And in a normal workplace, pre-COVID, on a 5-point scale, a typical workplace would report about a 2.8 with that question. And that's what he called serendipitous bonding. So just the accidental stuff that happens when you bump into people at the water cooler. Okay.
Yeah.
In the pandemic, it went down to 2.3. So his hypothesis is that the reason a lot of these bosses are all up in angst about back to the office, blah, 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 is they feel the difference between 2.8 and 2.3. But what Keith's work has shown is if you intentionally work with a working group to help it bond, to help it get to know each other, to know each other as people as well as just teammates, to actually be intentional about it, you can actually get teams up into the 4s, 4.5s within about a 6-month period. So here's what I think is the great fallacy of this whole debate about work from home, work from office. You can be toxically managed, totally micromanaged, lack of trust, everything bad, and be sitting in your bunny slippers in your living room. And you can be in the office and be energized and rewarded and feeling great about what you're doing. The place has much less to do with what's going on with you than the people that you're working with.
It's fascinating and true. I mean, this is what Patty and I preach all the time. Now we actually have data, Patty, that we can throw out to prove it. That's great.
Yeah. And it's that's not what the normal person's going to get when they go to Management 101 training. Right. And they're not going to get it when they do conflict management because,
No.
I mean, so it's a skill set that's really not available. And maybe that's one of the ones that comes with wisdom, but we don't know how to implement it.
Well, and let me add one other thing to this being in the office versus not in the office thing.
Mm-hmm.
If you are a senior leader at a major company, the office is pretty damn great. I mean, everybody's nice to you. Everybody looks up at you. You know, you flick your finger and coffee appears. I mean, it's awesome. You go home and your wife is pissed off because you didn't walk the dog. You have obnoxious teenage children who don't have any doubts about giving you feedback. You know, it's just not fun.
Yeah.
Much more fun to be at the office. But if you're an individual contributor, it's less fun.
Well, and this is another one of those like future of work. It's moot. It's trains left the station. It's a hybrid work is what we're going to do. Period. End of story. Get over it. Right.
Exactly.
And I don't, I remember the question would always be, and you probably get this question too. Do you know anybody that's doing it right? Right. When we're all doing the work from home thing. And I'm like, hell no, we're all making this up. Right. It's like nobody knows how to do it right because for once in our lives, it's not a best practices issue because what's right for Google, which isn't Google anymore, right?
A, B, C, D, E, F, G.
Isn't right for somebody else. And that we're starting to see more of a, in some organizations, here's the right component. In some organizations, here's the right component. But I think you're so right in that the people who make the decisions like it the way it used to be.
They do. They do. They love it. And I think, you made another very good point, which is something that I talk a lot about. It's intentional, right? There, for all of this to work, there has to be intention behind it, which should be the case whether you're in the office or at home. If we're going to spend time together, here's the intention. Here's what we're all going to get out of it. Instead of just having these meaningless one-on-ones and interactions and things like that. People want to feel inspired. People want more context. People want to know what the next hard problem is. People want to be part of the strategy, right? So if you can develop interactions, whether those are on Zoom or in person, that have more intention behind them, then you're going to have that 2.8 or 2.3, whatever it is, move up too, because people will feel more connected through those types of conversations with each other versus just meaningless conversations about stuff you talk about at the water cooler, which, not all of those are meaningless, but you know what I mean.
And there aren't any water coolers anymore.
I know.
Right. So Rita, Miss Strategy, I asked a kind of a personal question. Do you now pick organizations to engage in based on how much you think they'll hear you?
That's a hard one because, the ones that need to hear it the most are sometimes the least prepared to, right?
Yeah.
And I work with a lot of companies that are quite important to daily life, energy companies, food companies, companies that make textiles, and tech companies, of course, and banks. And so I would say that if I get the sensation that I'm being used like as a cover up, like, oh, see, we really mean it. We hired Rita McGrath and there's nothing behind it. Then I certainly won't do two of those.
No, I mean, I find it for myself. It's like I don't do speaking that much anymore when I'm entertainment. You can watch a video. That's fine. I mean, I really need to, and it's something I think that we've learned as people, as speakers, right? It's certainly way better to look them in the eye.
Yeah.
Than it is to look at yourself on the computer. So,
Rita, I know we're running out of time too, and I wanted to maybe get some words of inspiration because I, sort of got a little depressed thinking about all these bureaucratic, things that are, hindering companies from, being as successful as they can be. But inspire us with a story of success.
Sure. So, and by the way, I believe, and this is what the new book is about. I believe all of this stuff can be countered. And I think this concept that I think actually Netflix is a really good, kind of really early example of some of these principles, which is this permissionless organization, but with responsibility. So it's not like just to get to run around doing whatever you want. You also have to have accountability and responsibility. And that's that second part of the message a lot of people are kind of still missing. But what I'm seeing all around is these self-organizing groups that are creating potentially massive social change. So 2 quick stories. One is from Paula Blank, who's just stepping down as the president of Southern New Hampshire University. And he basically took back online education from these predatory for-profit schools. They are the largest university in America now. And he did it all using these principles of using humans at human touch points. So the professors do their thing, it's fine. But the person that really matters in this equation is the education counselor. And the education counselor has 40 students that they work with who stay with them through their whole journey. And the education counselor is the one that's been trained to say, the student calls up and says, hey, what do I owe for next semester's tuition? They're trained to ask the second question, right? Which is X. Tell me a little more about why is it important for you to know? Because what they're trying to figure out is, are they asking the question because they just want to budget and plan and that's transactional? Or I can't get the numbers to add up. My mother's in the hospital. I just don't know if I'm going to be able to repair my car so I can get to work. So the counselor is the one that gets them off those ledges and keeps them engaged in the program throughout the whole time. So there's this whole theory of scaled human systems, which I think is super valuable. So I'll give you another little bright spot. Fabulous person. You should have her on your show. Her name's Susanna Fox. And she wrote a great book called Rebel Health. And she was a super big noise in the Federal Department of Health and Human Services. I think she was their CTO or something. So super, super senior person, knows a lot about health. And in this book, what she talks about is how we've got this whole missing constituency in how our systems are designed, namely the patients themselves, their caregivers, and the survivors. And she says, what's starting to happen with the internet is these people are now finding each other. And so here's a great story. So take a machine that monitors you for type 1 diabetes. And it's bad. Like if you run out of insulin and you have type 1 diabetes, you die. And that's what it's like. So if you are the parent of a child with type 1 diabetes, the way the system is designed is every 2 hours you set your alarm. You go down the hall to your kid's bedroom. You open the door. You try not to wake them. You check the monitor that's on their body. And if it's okay, you go back to bed. Right. And so this woman was like, this is impossible. This is a really difficult way to live. Wouldn't it be great if I could have some way of remotely monitoring this thing? So anyway, she creates the support group on the internet for parents of type 1 diabetic kids. And then this hacker dude in Florida says, oh, wait a minute. I've got a way to do that. She's like, what? He says, so he figured out a way to hack into his kid's device and have it just project the data onto his mobile phone. So he still has to wake up every 2 hours. We haven't fixed that yet, but at least he doesn't have to wake the child, go into the room. He can just look at his phone and get it. Now, the position of the medical manufacturers, who she's been yelling at for years, by the way, is it's good enough. Why do we need to change this system? And so between this whole little community, they've created this complete solution, which is now self-determining. They can do it themselves. And they're putting pressure on the existing systems to change in ways that are better for the patients. And I'm just finding examples like that all over. And I think that's the power of this whole permissionless idea. These are emergent organizations. There's no CEO of this thing, right? Conferring around a commonly felt problem and bringing in the right expertise to deal with it.
That's great. Love it. Love it.
Well, we're going to roll into career confessions.
Oh, let's do career confessions. Okay.
All right. Should I read it?
You read it.
Okay. How do I lead my team through transformation without burning out? I'm a manager at my company, and we're going through a period of transformation and organizational restructuring. There has been a lack of support and structure, but I care about the company. How do I lead my team through this and retain as many folks as I can? I know some of them are burning out. Aren't we all? But they are great workers. I want to enhance employee satisfaction, address workload concerns, and foster a supportive environment to ensure Our team remains engaged and committed during this challenging phase, but I'm also at capacity. What should I do? What say you, Rita McGrath?
What say I? I want to start with a story. So there was a time in my life where I was running this research program for the Entrepreneurship Center at Wharton. And I was physically there to do that one day a week. So I had a packed day, right? So I'd be meeting with the students, setting up the agenda, looking at their work, packed. So my boss at the time, the estimable Ian McMillan, comes into my office when I first arrive in the morning, and he's got in tow this visiting scholar from Singapore. And he says to me, what I'd like you to do is take Professor Chen, let's call him, and I'd like you to take him to Harbier's lecture in the morning, and then bring him to lunch at the faculty house. And then there's a faculty seminar that's happening this afternoon. And I'm looking at my day, which has been meticulously planned, and it has just been blown up. And I looked at him and was like, Professor Chen, could you give us just a minute? So I went into the next room and I showed him. I said, this is my day. If you've decided as the boss of this place that what you've asked me to do is more important, then I will do that. But this is what's not going to happen. And you need to understand that. And I think, and this is kind of back to being truthful at work, we don't do that enough. And so we developed a metaphor. So by the way, it turned out that what he was basically doing was unloading this guy on me because he didn't want to have to entertain him all day long.
Right.
And that was the real heart of the story. So eventually we had one of the visiting scholars or something deal with him. But anyway, so we developed this metaphor, which I think might help your person. And the metaphor is a truck, right? And every one of us comes to work, however we define that, wherever we define that. We have a certain amount of energy, capacity, time to give to this thing we're calling work. And you can think of it like a truck. And that truck is full. And it is full every day that you're driving down your work highway. And so when a task comes up or a job is presented or something that calls your time is intended, I think a norm that says, okay, if you're sort of in a decision-making role, and this is the most important thing that you need me to do, I get that. I will arrange to do that. But you need to understand what's not happening because of that. And I think what you want to have is a system of, call them almost like breakers in your job handover situation. Because in any transformation, there's 10,000 things you could legitimately put your attention to. And there's probably 5 that actually matter. So it's really coming to an agreement about what are the things that are either the biggest bottlenecks or the biggest accelerants or the biggest things that are really going to be problematic down the road if we don't fix them, and get those things on the truck and let everything else kind of, maybe it's got a few dandelions in it. It's okay.
I don't even know if I can add anything. The driving your truck down the work highway. I mean, I love that.
I love it. And it's, I think it's a really wonderful concept that strategy is very often what you don't do.
Yeah. No, I was just going to say that, Patty, because at Netflix, we always talked about what are we not going to do? Like in strategy, the hardest thing to figure out is what you're not going to do, not to do all the things.
And I think in this particular person's case, recognizing that this person is not responsible for the whole thing, right? This person is like, I want my team to be engaged. I want this, I want that, I want perfection. It's like, well, they can do half of it.
Could I add one more thing, though, that I think managers don't realize enough? Just saying, I appreciate how hard you've been working. I'm really grateful that you're hanging in here with me. I can't imagine how I would have gotten through my week without you. Just expressing that.
Thank you.
Right?
Gratitude.
And I think what happens, by the way, is I think managers think that they do that, and then I don't think they actually do. So maybe make yourself a little pop up on your computer, like at 4:45, if your working day ends at 4:45. 2 people that you really want to acknowledge for what they
love
do.
it. Love it.
Rita,
love
you're
it,
amazing. I'm so glad we got to talk to you today, and I'm so glad I got to meet you.
Yay.
Now you have to be my friend too, not just Patty's.
I'll be your friend for
Should
sure.
be your friend.
And if you guys want to do this again, I'd love it. This is
Let's do
a lot
it.
of fun.
Let's do it.
We
So
love it.
when's your new book coming out?
Well, I'm still writing it. And, my daughter's getting married in August. So if you know this process, you will be familiar with the fact that every day I blocked off for writing ends up with 4 hours getting dedicated to who's doing the catering on Saturday night.
Well, some things are more important than other things.
Back to the truck, right?
Back to the truck. Back to the truck. Rita, thank you for everything. And where can folks find you if they want to know more?
So I have a website, very imaginatively called ritamcgrath.com, which is easy to find. And there you will find a blog archive, notes about my speaking, press coverage, stuff like that. So if you want to deep dive on that, I have a weekly-ish newsletter that I write, which is about exactly the same stuff like the baby boom and that kind of thing or the baby bust. And you can subscribe to that on Substack or Medium or LinkedIn or my own blog, wherever you happen to like getting stuff. And that's free. So you're welcome to join in, or you can look at the archives on my website.
Thanks for listening to TruthWorks. This episode was produced and edited by Megan Hayward and Mick Finnegan. Thank you to Kathleen Speckert and the whole Edit Audio team.